Hello everyone, and welcome to this fireside chat with Rachel Glennerster. I'm Habiba Banu and I'll be your MC for today. We're going to start with some short remarks from Rachel, and then we'll be doing a Q&A with some pre-prepared questions, and then very much welcome as many questions as you can on the Swapcard app. But I'll just start by introducing Rachel. Rachel is the president of the Center for Global Development and a leading development economist. She's pioneered the use of randomized trials to inform policy on health, education, democracy, and women's empowerment, and shaped markets to spur innovation on global challenges like pandemics and climate change. She previously served as chief economist at the UK's FCDO and executive director at JPAL at MIT. She helped launch Deworm the World and the pneumococcal vaccine. So would you all join me in welcoming Rachel to the stage?
Thanks, and I should say I was absolutely not one of the scientists who helped develop the pneumococcal vaccine. I was one of the economists who helped shape the markets to create the incentives to develop a pneumococcal vaccine. But yes, one of the things I'm proud of. So this is an apologies to anyone who in my last talk, there's going to be a few similarities. This can be quite a depressing time for those of us working on international development. It's not just the cuts in aid that we see in the US, but also in the UK and Germany and France and many other countries around the world. It's a more broad undermining of international cooperation, so things like tariffs and which will have a big impact on the world economy and therefore on incomes. And more generally, even before that, we were seeing a trend where low-income countries who had previously been catching up to high-income countries, that what we call as economists convergence, that catch-up between of low-income countries to high-income countries, that trend that was prevalent for over 20 years seems to have stalled. And the growth of populism and nationalism has again, not just in high-income countries, but we're seeing it in countries like the Philippines and India, which has real consequences for a lot of people. However, against that somewhat depressing background, I want to give us some reasons to be optimistic, because I think that there's a lot that can be done and is being done to change things for the better. So first of all, we need to remember how much progress has been made on improving the lives of the worst off amongst us in the world in the last 20, 30 years. I hope you're all familiar with all the statistics about declining mortality and infant mortality, but I think it's important to hang on to that, not just for our own self-preservation of thinking what we do matters, and keeping optimistic, but it's also important to keep telling that story, because as we make the case for development, it's important to explain that yes, it can work, and yes, it has worked, and yes, we have made a difference. Because as we see, the surprising lack of support or lack of pushback in the aid cuts, I think part of that was because people felt that aid wasn't being effective, but it was, and we were making progress. So it's important to hang on to that memory of that positive change. Second, it's important not to feel too dominated by the impact of aid, because aid is only a tiny proportion of what gets spent on anti-poverty programs around the world. Most of it is spent by low and middle income country governments. And if you look at things like education and health, by poor people themselves, they're actually the biggest spenders. So there's a lot of room to shape those programs and make those more effective, even if we think that we're never going to go back to as large aid budgets as we had before. I'm also another area of optimism is that this is a chance to reshape how things are done, because there's been so much radical change that, particularly in the US, where USAID was dismantled, now is the time when we can actually be thinking about how would you build a system better, in the hope that it does come back someday, and I'm pretty hopeful that it will. Fourth, innovation continues, and innovation is the major drive of human progress. It's the major drive of increasing income per capita, and it's the major drive of improvements in health, for example. A lot of countries of a similar level of income now to when rich countries were at that same level of income, countries now have much, much higher levels of health. Why? Because of technology and innovation in the health sector. So, things like invention of vaccines has really driven that. And so there's a lot of space and room to improve lives by pushing on innovation. It's also something that, a lot of people in this room are quite good at. A lot of effective altruists come from a scientific background, or even when you're working in a high-income country, it's something that we have quite a good comparative advantage to do things like work on a malaria vaccine, whereas other things have to be done much more locally. And finally, it's possible to make a difference. It's still really possible to make a difference. So, some of CGD's work on the impact of aid cuts in the US, we heard stories of them being discussed in the White House and leading to more waivers being issued, which means more programs brought back online. There's been pushback on the cutting of money to the famine early warning system, and that's now back online. So there is some response, when we make a fuss. I'm not saying that we can overturn all the aid cuts, but there is some political responsiveness. There are, work done by academics to look at how to improve social protection programs in low and middle income countries have led to changes that have dramatically improved the effectiveness of those programs, which, in India and Indonesia, which both reach millions of people, tens of millions of people. And I've been doing work with an NGO, Teaching at the Right Level Africa, that takes a proven technique for improving education in India and brought it to the African continent. And that's the kind of space where there's room for people who want to get involved in spreading the ideas that have come that are highly cost-effective and have been proved to be highly cost-effective. There's room for more, medical and agricultural breakthroughs. And there's even, other work that we've done at the Center for Global Development, and this was before my time, so I can't take any credit for it, but working on the technical aspects of how the multilateral development banks, i.e. the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, how they lend based on the amount of capital. There was work done to show that it would be prudent. You could still be prudent and lend a lot more based on how much capital you have. So countries wouldn't have to put in more capital to these banks, and they would still be able to lend an awful lot more. And that led to literally billions of more dollars going. So working on these kind of technical issues can sometimes have very big payoffs. So that's my reason to keep going and keep being optimistic and thinking that groups like this can make a real difference. And happy to take questions now.
So thank you for setting the scene and also giving us some reason for hope. Just to start off with a bit of a discussion around what we can be doing in the wake of some of these cuts. You mentioned that there has been sometimes a response if we do make a fuss, and some of the things that there have been some movement on is like the famine warning system. Are there any other glaring gaps that you're seeing you really want to see more people making a fuss about? Maybe some people in the room can help make a fuss about them.
Yeah, let me talk about some work which a really interesting team which have now come under the wing of the Centre for Global Development, but really started before us, called the PRO team, has been doing. They've actually been going through all the projects that were cut by USAID and filtering them to highlight which were the most cost-effective, life-saving programs. So there might be cost-effective education programs, but they're looking at life-saving and cost-effective and can still be saved, right? Some projects can't be saved anymore. And they did that process and actually came up with a list of, what are the things that we most need to save and are still savable. And so and then they're fundraising for it. And, they've already raised millions of dollars to come in and support those. That's a sort of very practical example, and when we start seeing, cuts in other places, I think, a similar process of thinking through what is it that's particularly cost effective that's being cut and really lobbying for that.
So their website, I think, is proimpact.tools, if you want to look them up to see some of the work that they've done. And they sort of explain a bit more about their methodology that they've used and some of the things that they're really highlighting. Yeah,
I mean, obviously, that's a little bit different from the kind of general pushback and general advocacy. But I do think there is benefit in... I mean, I was just really shocked at how little pushback there was in the UK to the announcement of the aid cuts. And if we don't make more fuss, then people just think it's easy to do it next time. So I think as it becomes evident what is going, I think now what people tend to do is just say, oh well, you shouldn't cut girls, or you shouldn't cut water, or you shouldn't cut, and that's a whole sectors, and I think that's less effective than saying, because then you just end up with the aid budget being spread thin over lots of different things. But just making, I think it's important to make the case that we need to make sure that the money goes to the poorest countries, and that's something the UK's was very good at, but then started spreading it much thinner and across a lot more countries. And I think pushing again that it should be focused on the poorest countries is important, and something that is a general advocacy, argument that you can make. And then where there are specific programs, that we think are highly cost effective, pointing those out.
Yeah, so a question from the audience is, what models of advocacy seem to work particularly well with government, if you have any insights on this?
Yeah, so this is not something I've studied. So I think, I'm hesitant to say things that I don't know the evidence on.
Mm-hmm. Classic economist answer, you want to be evidence-backed.
So I do, but I think it needs to look genuine. So in the sense of, it needs to go to, your MPs, and it needs to be kind of mass. So it's not just the NGOs complaining, right? It's actually regular people complaining. I think that's the most effective, and then it has to be mass, but that can be. Now, it can be the NGOs, or it can be technical complaints if it's a technical argument of, no, this is a particular, like the FuseNet thing, like the famine early warning system, like that was a technical argument, and it was fine to come from technical people saying, no, this is really important for, preventing famines, and really nobody else is doing it. So there's that kind of advocacy, and then there's mass-based advocacy. We need both.
So that, because otherwise, I guess the NGOs themselves might be seen as being more self-serving, that they don't want to cut their own areas, but a broad constituency can sort of say, we want our taxpayer money to go towards Gavi or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one feature that we've seen, and we actually saw in the UK a few years before, is the sort of amalgamation of the aid department, DFID, into just the wider FCDO. And that's now maybe like a dynamic that we're seeing elsewhere, and this is happening to USAID. I was wondering, from your experience of working in the UK, what is that like as a process? What are the downsides of this? Are there any upsides of this kind of these kinds of reorganizations?
Yeah, total nightmare. And I mean, for many different reasons. Partly, just whenever you reorganize a bureaucracy, nobody focuses on the substance for a year, at least. Mm-hmm. And that is just a general problem. Every time the World Bank reorganizes, a new president comes in and they reorganize things, and nobody focuses on the substance for at least a year. And that's just, that's a big cost. The other thing, the real problem with merging aid and foreign affairs departments is they just operate on completely different timescales. So it just means that the classic problem of urgent and important, and you just spend all your time on the urgent things and you don't get to the important things. That is just what happens. Okay. Because, I remember I was one of the few development experts who ended up in the senior management, the weekly senior management meetings in the merged. And, I would always go in with something that I wanted to talk about. But there would be some, crisis over China or Iran or something. And you just, you couldn't complain that that's what people were talking about, because of course they needed to talk about that. But you just never got, and my thing could be talked about next week. But of course, next week there was another crisis. Mm-hmm. And so it just meant that there was nobody thinking about the long term. And I think that's a general issue in government, is that unless you set aside someone whose job it is to think about the important but not incredibly critically time-sensitive, mm-hmm. it just never gets looked at. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the fundamental problem here. Mm-hmm. Now, there's also a whole bunch of issues about expertise. Mm-hmm. And many, certainly the Foreign Office, but other foreign affairs departments have a view of kind of generalists, whereas development is sort of, you have specialists who know about, humanitarian logistics, yep. and can run a relief program and know exactly and you just can't. I remember having conversations where, well, now we're joint and, the IMF team is, so we'll send the ambassador. And I'm like, for God's sake, don't send the ambassador. They're not an economist. You cannot get anywhere mm-hmm. in trying to persuade an IMF team to change their programs by just saying, oh, it's all, politically very important. You need to send in someone who can speak their language. Mm-hmm. And so you need, there's a huge problem of loss of expertise.
Does that mean that these kind of new merged departments need to draw on outside expertise a bit more, like places like CGD or something like that, to provide that deep technical expertise?
You can, obviously, great if you come talk to us, but you need people who are good, who understand the issues, to be good consumers, mm-hmm. too. I think, DFID had lots of good economists. They didn't do research, but they could read it and understand it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important, that you have people in government who are able to understand the evidence. Mm-hmm. And development is just, it's a very different way of thinking. You have to, if you sit in a rich country and try and solve development problems, you just aren't thinking of the logistical challenges. You've got to keep it really simple, or you just can't implement. And that, in really poor countries, because everything is just 10 times more difficult to make happen. And so if you need people who've kind of lived that experience and understand it. You asked me a question of was there anywhere where there was a benefit of merger? I think the one area I would say is you've seen a number of hires of ambassadors in low-income countries who actually have development experience.
Okay.
So we now have ambassadors in the UK who know about low-income countries. But I think now, arguably, I would never want to be an ambassador because I don't think you spend a lot of your time kind of going to functions. So maybe it's a bit of a waste of their expertise, so they're ambassadors. So, but to the extent that they're making decisions, it's good that they know about how these countries work. I mean, the UK ambassador to India is someone with deep development experience now, for example.
And this was more possible because now their portfolio more includes development, and so it sort of makes them better suited for an ambassador role.
Because the Foreign Office picked ambassadors, and now they're part of the team, and they didn't like picking ambassadors from other departments.
Interesting. It'd be really interesting to see if that cashes out in any difference in the UK's approach with India or something like that. I guess we might not see for a while.
I don't think it's a good trade-off, but it's the one thing I can see.
Okay. So you talked a lot about, aid isn't the whole story here. There's a lot of money that comes from low and middle income countries themselves. So one of the questions that we've got from the audience is, how can African governments best raise revenues in order to fill the budget gaps that they've got by the aid cuts? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So it's been important for African governments to raise tax revenues for a long time, even before aid cuts. And I think, this is an area where there's increasing amount of evidence, and in an area but where there should be an awful lot more evidence. So, people who are in the business of thinking about, running trials, this is an area I think where there's a lot more to do. I was just speaking at a conference in Hamburg and, said that where you really need more tax raising is on property tax. I got a round of applause just in the middle of my talking. So that clearly resonates.
We've got a fan in the audience today.
And the reason is that it's not very strongly taxed. It is immovable. So, it's very easy to hide wealth in Swiss bank accounts, but
your mansion can't go anywhere else.
But your mansion can't go anywhere else. And people like living in mansions, so the rich do tend to. That there are ways now to do, satellite imaging type thing to do, because there is a lot of corruption in evaluation of, but there are kind of ways where you can have checks to reduce the corruption in valuation. And anyway, it's better to have some property tax, even if there is some corruption in it, and a combination of some transparency about it, and also some using things like satellite imagery.
Okay. And one other piece is, instead of thinking about the non-profit sector, I guess, what about the private sector? Is there a role for, I think maybe there's an increased focus on interventions having income revenue streams and being self-sustaining. That's sort of one way of doing a sort of social impact project that sort of is self-sustaining. Another option is just straightforwardly thinking about business as useful in and of itself, in the way that it's maybe meeting a market demand or providing employment. How do you think about the role of the private sector now, especially in the wake of aid changes?
So those are two very different aspects of the private sector. I think there's been a lot of interest in social entrepreneurship. I would say I'm less optimistic about social entrepreneurship than many other people, but with a bit of a caveat. Okay, so why do I think it's more challenging than you might think? Well, one is a lot of social entrepreneurship is about, things like health products, and there's a lot of evidence that people are very price sensitive to health products. So it's actually quite hard to get poor people to pay for things that are good for them, but good for them in the long run, just because of our behavioral biases mean that we want instant gratification, and we all do. It just hurts the poor more because they have less money to spend. Behavioral biases hurt them more, but we're all prone to them. But if we indulge occasionally, it's not the end of the world. So that's a problem in getting people to pay for things that are good for them in the long run. It's that behavioral bias means it's hard. And that explains the price sensitivity. So you've got to really charge really low amounts to get people to buy things. Now, that doesn't mean that there is social entrepreneurship where you sell to governments. And that is a much more promising route. So if you design a malaria vaccine, the malaria vaccine at Oxford wasn't a private sector one, but, there are, like the pneumococcal vaccine, and you sell to Gavi, well, that's a private investment. This is an extremely good thing, and we ought to be doing more of that and encouraging more of that. But that route is because you're selling to Gavi or selling to governments. So selling directly to the poor and starting a small organization that's going to sell to the poor, there's remarkably few things that have scaled that way.
Okay.
Then you said about, the private sector, like getting more investment in low and middle income countries. I think that is, really important in the way there's a lot of evidence that there's a lot of learning that happens when foreign companies come in there's a great paper on carpets that makes this point. But they employ people, and employment is the route to growth. So that's very important, but what can you do about it? Well, a lot of the things that need to be done to make more private investment in low and middle income countries is about getting the policy right in those countries and tackling some pretty difficult issues about reliable electricity and land rights and all these things that are kind of politically quite hard to do.
Okay. So tricky.
Yeah, worth working on because the returns are very hard. The classic EA thing of, small probability of a high return. But,
could be a good moonshot. Okay, thanks for covering so much ground in that question. I'd like to talk about some of the other areas of your work as well. So one of the big focuses that you have had has been on market shaping as a way of trying to fix these sort of market failures and incentivize things being created. So could you tell me a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing, specifically the prize, I guess, to start with?
So just to explain a little bit more, market shaping is to promote innovation. And as I said in my intro remarks, innovation it's the driver of economic growth over the centuries and also a big driver of improvements in health and human welfare. But the problem is that you get massively too little innovation because the person who invents something captures a very small percentage of the benefit of inventing it because other people copy it, copy the idea, the people who develop it and sell it, a lot of the return goes to them. So the innovator often gets very little return compared to the social benefit. So that means that providing more incentives, aligning the social and private benefit better, would lead to more innovation and more social benefit. how do you do that? Well, there are a number of different mechanisms to reward innovation. You could have a prize where you get a lump sum for inventing something. The problem with that is that you might invent something that's not very easy to scale or very easy to use. And so the mechanism that I'm quite a fan of is an advanced market commitment, where you get rewarded for the innovation to the extent that people buy it. Mm-hmm. And that makes sure that the incentives are aligned to design something that is very easy to use and people like. And it makes it much easier to set the parameters of, if you writing down a prize, this is what I want from an improved cook stove, you write it all down, but you might forget something. Whereas if somebody actually has to buy it before you get the reward, then it has to be good for them, for the end user, otherwise. So we've been thinking about sort of where are the gaps where we need innovations, where there's a big gap between social and private return, and where there are where we think that market shaping would be the answer, because it's not always the answer. So one of the groups that won, we ran a prize of people could put in ideas from anywhere around the world, and then we sort of answer these questions of why do you think there's a big gap between social and private return? What market mechanism, how many people could benefit, the classic sort of tractability impact kind of scan. And we got 3 winners, and actually Neotest, Akil is somewhere in the audience and is giving a presentation at 4:00 this afternoon if you want to learn more about his prize-winning idea about a diagnostic for neonatal sepsis, which I'm very excited about, and we are into the design stage of that. There was something to do with pandemics about a universal treatment for different pandemic problems, and then something on repurposing drugs, which is the fact that a lot of drugs could have uses for other diseases. But once they're off patent, there is absolutely no incentive to look for other potential diseases. But if you've got a centralized buyer of drugs, like a government, they could easily commit to pay more to whoever proved that it's useful in the other disease. So imagine there are 10 different generic suppliers of a drug, right? And one of them goes off and tests that this drug is useful in another situation. Well, then all 10 are going to sell to that new disease, but you pay the top up to the one who actually did the work to develop it. So it makes sure that the money flows to the person who did the trial to prove that it works in another disease. And actually, with the data that the US has on when it buys drugs for Medicare and Medicaid, it could do that, because it knows what the drug's being bought for, whether it's the old version, the old diagnostic, the old usage, or the new usage. So I'm very excited about that. So three things all really, really exciting.
And the stage that these ideas are at is, what's the work that's being done now? Are they sort of like designing a mechanism, or trying to encourage government to like start a mechanism, or what's the process now?
Mainly it's designing the mechanism. So there's quite a bit of sort of complicated economics goes into how do you design this exactly the right way. But so for Neotest, for example, we brought together a group that's just about to start, of health experts, people who understand about how diagnostics are used in hospitals and who does the buying of the diagnostic and that sort of thing, because you have to understand the market structure that you're selling into. And then a bunch of industrial organization economists who think about contract structure and, because you get the contract structure slightly wrong and you end up, incentivizing the wrong thing.
It's all about, you really get what you incentivize, so you've got to make sure you design it well.
You write the contract well. And this is because you're writing the contract before you have the thing. So it's quite hard to get it right.
And then is the idea that these would be run privately, or is the idea that you're sort of hoping that government would run or does it really depend on what the ultimate design is?
Yeah, so the sprint one on the universal therapeutic is the amounts of money there has got to be government. So there, the idea is that they're trying to persuade European governments to come up with the money to say that if there was a universal therapeutic that we could stockpile, then they would say, if you come up with something, we as a government will stockpile it for the next pandemic.
And no private buyer's got enough money for that. It's got to be the government.
It's got to be the government. We're talking billions. And then the neo-test is a smaller amount. So I think, a combination, we might be able to persuade the Indian government that they want to kick in a bit of money, or say that they would buy, and then if it was invented, but it's probably be philanthropic money. And it's doable with philanthropic money.
So one of the things I've wondered, once we get to the stage where we have a good design in mind, we need to get someone to adopt it, maybe we need to lobby government to adopt this. Is that something that people should be doing, academics or nonprofits should be doing to try and lobby? One of the things that I wonder about is in some cases, pharma companies stand to make quite a lot of profit here, and they have quite loud voices in sort of arguing to government about things that might benefit them. So maybe we should expect that at some point, once we know what the design is, actually the pharma companies will advocate for it themselves, and there's not so much need for academics or for nonprofits at that stage.
So the problem with market shaping is you're designing it so the companies don't make a huge amount of money.
Okay.
So they're not, what they're interested in, they like push funding.
Okay.
They give me money to do it, whether it works or not.
Yeah.
That's great for them.
This is just give them a contract.
Whereas what we're saying is, we will buy it off whoever does it the best. And so it's open competition. The problem is the political economy of that is not great, because no individual firm knows they're going to win it. Now, the pneumococcal was actually different because it was pretty clear that two firms were pretty close to getting it. So that was an AMC that was really about getting out a product rather than inventing a product. It's what people call a near-term AMC, but it was really about making, and it was effective because it got the vaccine out 5 years earlier. Out to a very large number of people 5 years earlier than is normally the case, which saves a lot of lives. But it was true that GSK knew that, and the British government knew that GSK was close, and they were like, oh, we'll ban that because that's a British company. So there was a political economy going on there that you can't do. If you do it right, there's not a huge amount of rents.
Okay.
So that's what the thing we ran into with the pneumococcal vaccine too was, well, we were originally trying to get it for a malaria vaccine. And this is way back. So I wrote the book on my maternity leave. So that would be 99. There's a piece I wrote with in work in progress with others on, why didn't we get a malaria vaccine earlier? So we were trying to do it for a malaria vaccine, and I really honestly think that it would have, we would have got a malaria vaccine way earlier if we'd done this. But the pharmaceutical companies would not come in to support this, because what they said was, their public line is, we're not working on malaria vaccine because it's too hard, it's not possible. not because we wouldn't make money, because we'd be forced to keep a low price because there'd be so much demand from poor countries. We never think about profits when we decide what to invest in. And you're like, that's actually, you could be sued by your shareholders if you didn't think about it. Like, that's just not possible. But they can't admit that because they get all this bashing in the public discourse. So they won't come in and say, we need more money, we need more of an incentive to work on a malaria vaccine because otherwise we're not going to, because they won't admit that that's why they're not working on it. So that's a bit of a problem.
Okay. So there is, okay.
So yeah, you have to kind of keep, yes, we can't rely on the pharmaceutical
to advocate for it themselves.
Advocate.
And it seems like, given the large number of ideas that you had from this prize, that there are just a lot of different areas that this could be suitable for. Maybe there could be kind of AMCs for a lot of different innovations. And it's great that there's these 3 that have got to the final stage, but maybe there are just many, many more things that this could be applicable for. Do you feel that there's a huge kind of gap here that there's?
Yeah, it's interesting because there are a lot of people saying they're going to do an AMC for this or that, and it's become a very hot topic. First of all, can I just put out there that 90% of the things that people say are an AMC are not an AMC. So it's our branding was so good that it's been used by so many people, but has nothing to do with what the original idea was. So, for example, and sometimes it's getting a bit of a bad name. So the Gavi program for getting, or the COVAX program for getting COVID vaccines to low-income countries was called an AMC. It was neither advanced nor a market nor a commitment. But hey, they like the name. So, but a lot of people are thinking about this as a good idea, and there are a lot of good ideas out there. Unfortunately, it is a little tricky to design it well. And so at the moment, I would like to get us a few designs like that were actually designed well. And we're also doing a lot of work on this is, on just helping people think through if these are the problems, you want to design it this way or so I think it's a really good idea. I'm slightly worried about literally 1,000 flowers blooming because I think they won't necessarily be designed very well. So, but I think we should do, 10 or more than we're doing at the moment. Then we'll get the design right, and then we can push for more.
And I guess if you need to prove to a lot of the stakeholders that this is worthwhile and this can work,
yes, we have to prove it can work first. Yeah, because the one that has been done is the pneumococcal, and that wasn't even for promoting innovation. That was for getting it out.
Okay. Okay, so there's still more to show that it can be done for actually developing, I think, in the first place. One alternative that I was wondering about is that, so a lot of this is to do with the fact that, companies are motivated by private benefit, as you might expect, and they are not motivated by the social benefit.
As they were fiduciarily required to worry about, yes.
But there are humans in the world who are motivated by social benefit, and there are maybe organizations that we could set up that could be designed to be motivated by social benefit. So is there some, what is the role that could be played by more of these kind of publicly supported kind of organizations that could fund or support this kind of innovation or development? I think there are versions of this kind of thing where there's been a lot more kind of public money that goes into innovation and development, and you don't have to try and set the incentives up right for incentivizing a private actor to do this.
Well, I think that it depends whether you think that the innovation can be done by a small startup or whether it needs bigger companies to come in, and that depends on what the innovation is. I think sometimes you need big companies to do the trials because they're if you think about the model of biotech and pharmaceutical, which obviously I've thought a lot about having worked in this space for a while, you've got people who are good at doing the innovation, but why do they then get bought up by pharmaceutical companies? Well, partly because they're really good at running trials. The big trials that you require to get through approval, that's their kind of specialty. And also they have the money, they have the capital to be able to. So their specialty is in looking at the different options and picking the right ones. So we often think that, maybe governments aren't good at picking winners, but this, in a sense, that's what pharmaceutical companies do. They look at all the options and kind of pick the ones they think are going to be winners. But other things, you might be able to do more with less capital, but you have to think about what's the distribution system. How is this going to get out there? So if it's so my husband, Michael Kramer, has been doing a lot of work on weather forecasting, improve weather forecasting for farmers in low and middle income countries. You don't need a huge team to do a better weather forecast, right? You don't need a big pharmaceutical company to back it. And the distribution system is not that hard and not that expensive. Like a lot of countries have these big, SMS things to farmers, or you can put it on the radio. So you don't need to have a big capital behind it. So you've got those distribution systems that are cheap. Other things you need to be able to slot into a big distribution system. Now, maybe the government is that, you've invented a new way of teaching. Well, then you can go through, you just need to be able to target quite centralized governments and work with them. So think about whether you can piggyback on a big distribution system or whether you need to, the distribution system has to be private sector, and then you've got to really think about, there's got to be sort of big money behind it. And we've done some work on climate, on, carbon removal. And there are all these startups in this space. But carbon removal is really expensive. And if it's going to work at scale, it's going to be very big. And you really can't, it's not going to work unless you get probably the big fossil fuel companies and mining companies involved, because they have the money and they have the expertise to do big projects. And I just don't think it's going to work through startups.
Okay. Yeah. One last sort of quick discussion I'd love to have is a bit more on pandemic prevention, just a small topic. There are a lot of things that you, I think, have done research on that, learnings that we have or ideas that we have about what we could be doing in pandemic prevention that have not gotten as much traction lately as everyone's sort of moved on from COVID. So I was wondering, are there any of these things that are like top of mind at the moment or sort of seem like real winners that we are unfortunately not focusing on enough?
Yeah, I mean, it was my list of depressing things at the beginning could have included the cancellation of the mRNA vaccine for bird flu, which is exactly the kind of thing that we should be doing. So what are some of the things? I and others in the market shaping team that is now joint with Dartmouth, University of Chicago and Center for Global Development is some changes in how the World Bank provides lending, which meant that it was not able. So let me just step back. The big lesson for me from the pandemic, and I was working in the British government during COVID, and we realized really early on that if we could get a vaccine, that would be a game changer, that the biggest constraint was getting enough of the vaccine. Everyone was worrying about distribution, but if you got enough of it early enough, there wouldn't be so much constraint about who got it. So just getting the scale up to happen much faster. And the way to do that was to pour money in before you knew whether it was approved. And that is exactly what the US and the UK did, and that is why they had the vaccine first. And I spent a lot of that year when the UK and the US were doing that, trying to persuade other countries to do that too. Pour money into scaling up the manufacturing of the vaccine. And we actually got some traction in Latin America, where you have some very good economists in government who completely got the idea. They understood that was the right thing to do. And a Minister of Finance said, if I do that in the vaccine, I absolutely understand that that's a cost worth paying. You know, the probability, even if there's only a 10% probability that the vaccine works, it's worth putting a lot of money into it. And if I do that and it doesn't work, I'm going to jail. Because I will have been seen as a corrupt thing. And what you needed was the World Bank to be providing loans to countries at that time, the bank to say, we have vetted this, we think it's a good idea, we realize it's risky, but the benefits are so big that we think it's a good idea, and we will provide a loan to anyone who wants to buy into any of these vaccine candidates that were around. And those vaccine candidates could then have built more factories, and there would have been a lot more vaccine earlier. The bank could not do that because their procurement rules mean that you can't buy something that doesn't exist yet, which makes complete sense normally, but we just need them to change the rules now because we tried to get them to change the rules in the middle of COVID, and they're just going bananas with all the things that they had to do. They're like, we can't do that now. So that is, you know, there's some technical things like that to allow countries to do in advance purchasing during the next pandemic. The other thing that we should be doing is we need to be investing in making our vaccine production much more flexible so that you can scale up in a pandemic. And mRNA is very flexible, but we're not producing very much stuff on mRNA. We produce a lot of flu vaccine every year. It's not mRNA, it's eggs. We use none of our flu vaccine capacity to do COVID vaccines because it was just not, you couldn't switch it over in time. Because you're literally using a chicken egg to grow the vaccine. Like, that is not a very scalable thing to do. So let's start producing all our flu vaccines mRNA, and then we can switch it to the pandemic vaccine like that. There's so many things, there's so many like basic things like that we could do that aren't very expensive. We have some proposals that are very expensive, which is just having a bunch of capacity left idle, but sort of run every so often, and it would be absolutely worth it that you could just move into it in the next. But you could pay factories when they're doing, if they're building a factory this size, just pay them to make it that size, so that they could expand into it. We're not doing anything.
Okay. So plenty of ideas to work on, maybe food for thought for people in the audience who want to go away and try and make some of these things happen. But that is all the time that we have for today in this fireside chat. But thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today.